Welcome, everyone, to the webinar. My name is Anand Akela. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Acalview Technologies. As the holidays approach, today we thought of sharing the learnings from one of the most popular holidays movie, Home Alone. We'll discuss how to outsmart attackers in Home Alone style. We'll take a cue from one of the most inventive defenders ever, Kevin McCallister. Like Kevin, more modern defenders succeed by knowing what matters most. They understand the home base. They anticipate attackers' move and use every tool strategically. Our speaker today is Marita Morowitz. She is the MITRE Engage Lead, where she works in the area of adversary engagement, malware analysis, and reverse engineering. She's founding member of MITRE's Cyber Deterrence and Adversary Management, CDAM team, and has helped shape MITRE's adversary engagement work for the last many years. Many of you already know about MITRE and its cybersecurity knowledge base, resources, and frameworks like Attack and Engage. Engage is a framework for planning and discussing adversary engagement operations. And at Acalview, we are proud to be a benefactor of this prestigious organization, MITRE Engage, and support the research and development to advance innovation in cyber deception and adversary engagement. Today, we also have Marita's colleague, Shane, join us, although he will be on audio only as a panelist to answer questions. So welcome, Shane. And of course, welcome, Marita.
Thank you.
Very good. We'll also have Suril Desai, our VP of Detection Engineering, joining us as a panelist. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a discussion and take questions. Before I hand over to Marita, let me direct you to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, the Zoom webinar window, for asking questions. Please feel free to ask questions as you get them at any time. We'll take them after Marita's presentation. With that, Marita, over to you.
Wonderful. All right. So we're going to jump right in. So as I said, my name's Marita. I'm the lead for the MITRE Engage team. And I'm really excited to be sharing this presentation with all of you and to kind of explore all this together. So with that, we're going to jump right in. There we go. A little bit of a roadmap of where we're going today. So we're going to just start off a little bit of level setting for anyone who isn't as familiar with adversary engagement and cyber deception and those topics, just to make sure we're all starting from a common base and help us think a little bit differently. And then we're going to jump right into what Kevin can teach us about deception and explore Kevin's top 3 lessons. And then we will end, as was said, with a panel Q&A. So plenty of material to get through, and here we go. So I want to do a little bit of a starting point for everyone. So hopefully you have seen Lord of the Rings. Luckily, I can't see you. So if you haven't seen it, don't tell me. Just go watch it or read the books. I'm not going to be a stickler for which one. Please go watch the movies or read. But this is kind of my favorite way of thinking about deception. What you see here is Helm's Deep, which the characters really believe is sort of the stronghold against evil. And everyone sort of feels like this fortress is impenetrable. And as long as they can get behind the walls of Helm's Deep, everything will be fine. And there's a line from the movie that says something along the lines of Helm's Deep has stood for 3,000 years. So, if we can get behind the walls, the bad guys are coming, it'll all be okay. And no one paid attention to this. It's a small storm drain in one of those outer walls. And then there's a big giant fight with the bad guys. In the middle of that fight, this guy shows up. And 30 seconds later, all hell has broken loose because no one paid attention to that little storm drain until the bad guys have put a bomb in that storm drain. And boom, there goes those big walls. And I won't spoil the book or movie for you, but at this point, things aren't looking super great for our heroes in the movie at this point. And in a lot of ways, this is similar to what defenders are facing today with defense in depth, right? It's sort of our Helm's Deep. We all feel like if we build enough walls, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with this concept of defense in depth, where you have sort of these series of physical, perimeter, internet, host, application, data security. We build enough walls that we'll all be okay. But the reality is that, especially when we're talking about advanced persistent threats or other targeted threats where they have a lot of resources, persistent adversary will make their way through. And so how do we think differently about those walls? And how do we think differently about the inside of those castles so that on the day that that happens, unlike our heroes in Helm's Deep, where they had to rely on magic to help them, we don't have to rely on magic because unfortunately Gandalf is not coming. So I want to start off with this. This is a Where's Waldo puzzle, or if you're in Australia, it's a Where's Wally puzzle. Give everyone a second to see if you can find Wally in this picture. And for the sake of time, I will point out that Wally is up at the top here. You know, and these Where's Waldo pictures are something really common, right? And the interesting thing about them is that they're not hard to solve because of Waldo himself, right? He's kind of this dorky guy in a red and white striped hat. It'd be pretty obvious where he is, but he isn't because of the picture itself. Overlapping colors, similar repeating lines and themes. Wally's girlfriend strangely looks a lot like Wally, right? So there's lots of reasons why it's hard to pick him out, or if you think you found him, potentially you haven't actually found Waldo. And so I think this is a great example of one of the ways we can be thinking about opportunities to make it so just because the bad guys have gotten into our system doesn't mean all hope is lost. How do we create that same ambiguity so that there's uncertainty, there's confusion, it's not obvious? Now, I have switched to a second puzzle. I don't know how many of you have started to solve this puzzle, but there's no Waldo in this puzzle. I actually cropped him out of the puzzle. Oftentimes when I'm doing this in front of a live audience, I get to watch these sort of embarrassed smirks right now as people realize, yeah, I was looking for him. And my question is always, you know, how much longer do you think you would have spent searching for him before you gave up? Right? How do we put puzzles in front of, or challenges in front of our adversary that they think they understand the situation? You'd seen a Where's Waldo puzzle before. This clearly looked like one. I never said to start solving it, but because we had just solved the previous one, it sort of felt like the right thing to do. Now, how do we start putting things in front of the adversary that looks like, the goal to achieve, the path to achieve their goal is clear, and yet we're really wasting their time, wasting their resources. My last little, or one of my last little ones to kind of get us thinking about all this, we have a park. Our goal is to get from one side of the park to the other side of the park. One of your paths look like this, and the other path looks like that. Which route are you going to take to get to the other side? Now, I'm not quite sure how in from daylight to darkness, but we're going to go with it. So I think oftentimes looking at this, it's quite obvious that the path on the right is the path we're going to take. It's well lit. I don't feel like I'm going to get eaten by a bear. I know exactly how I'm going to make it across. And so in a similar way, how do we outline paths look like the safe, obvious choice? But in reality, we don't have to say adversary go here. We can put our sensing, our monitoring, feel like we are controlling that path, feeling like we are leading away from things that are important and towards the things that are unimportant without the adversary ever realizing that we're subtly guiding them that way. Now, looking at this picture, I gave you the two options, but did anyone think about the fact that the closest way to get to that was probably just to cut straight across, right? Because I offered you two paths, it sort of felt like, okay, I should choose one of those, when in reality, there was other options. But again, that very nature of a path being there feels like you are being asked to go down that path. And so again, how do we think about creating these paths through our network that in reality are us moving the adversary in specific directions? And then finally, we have our friend Dumbo here. So clearly, Dumbo is not in his natural habitat. And yet, the researcher in this picture is able to study Dumbo. Dumbo probably has no idea that this isn't everything his life could possibly be, because there's recreated enough of that natural environment that it's realistic. It provides enough enrichment for Dumbo. He's able to show all of his natural behaviors. In a similar way, how do we think about doing that for our adversaries so that we are giving them environments and that might look like ours, but not really be ours? Maybe they have specific elements that we're trying to understand. How would an adversary react given this set of assets or circumstances? Whatever that might be. And the goal here is really, how can we elicit contextualized, timely, attack surface relevant CTI, similarly to how the defender here, or sorry, the researcher here is able to observe things about them. So this brings us to my dam metaphor. This kind of dam. Adversaries are an endless stream. We're going to stop what we can with defense and depth. but we're going to assume that the APT will always find a way through. Adversaries often are going to try to follow the path of least resistance. Therefore, we want to make their job difficult, confusing, slow, limit the impact that they can have before detection. So it's thinking about that Where's Waldo puzzle. We're going to channel them away from things that are important, thinking about that park. And we're going to give ourselves every opportunity to find them quickly by planting tripwires along likely paths. And all of this, we're going to start by thinking about how we can build up our understanding of the adversary with that contextualized, timely, relevant CTI so that we're able to do this as best as we possibly can. So let's give a couple of definitions now that we've started to think about this, just so we make sure we're all talking about exactly the same things. Oftentimes, I think with denial and deception, we hear these words a lot and have slightly different definitions, and potentially where you're coming from, you're going to have different reactions. You know, if you say the word deception in a US government sort of DOD, DOW sort of space, it has very different meanings than if you say it, you know, in industry. So depending on your background, want to have some clear definitions. We talk about denial. We're saying, you know, what are the things that we can do to conceal facts and fictions to create ambiguity for what is and is not real? When we talk about deception, we're saying, how do we reveal facts and fictions to actively create or reinforce perceptions or cognitions or beliefs? And then finally, really what Engage is all about is bringing these two things together. And we refer to this as adversary engagement, or this idea that strategic planning and analysis really have to be at the heart of using these technologies. And if we want to use them effectively, we have to think about that. Additionally, I wanted to add two other terms for us here. Honeypot, I think most are probably familiar with the idea of a honeypot, where we have a decoy system or service and we're emulating real infrastructure. Honey tokens, I think, are becoming more of an accepted terminology, but this idea of decoy data or artifacts, they might be files, forensic artifacts, fake users, database records, API keys, anything you can think of. The idea is that it's just a thing sitting on what could be a real system, and it's designed so that if it would not actually be accessed under normal circumstances. So therefore, any use of this thing is going to be indicative of something else going on. My last warning is, you know, we always want to be thinking about this as poison, not venom. If anyone's taken John Strand's course, I have the link in the slides. It's available for free on YouTube, but he uses this analogy, and I think it's a perfect one, where a venomous snake is going to reach out and bite you, but that poisonous dart frog, the only way you can be impacted by its poison is if you eat it first. And so in the same way, to keep ourselves on the right side of the law and the right side of all of this, we want to be thinking about how are we a poison dart frog? So the adversary has to attack us first or go after us first in some way in order to be impacted. We're not talking about hack. All right. Oh no, I didn't do my little animation correctly, but that's okay. So how do we get started? Kevin here is going to help us out. And this brings us to Kevin's top 3 lessons on cyber deception planning. Deception is a process, not a tech stack, said by Kevin McCallister. It was in that Home Alone 3 that no one watched. I promise it was in there somewhere. So first and foremost is that we want to know our environment before the adversary does. Second is that deception is about more than just detection. And third is use what you have and layer your defenses. And these are Kevin's 3 lessons, and we'll go over each of these. So first and foremost, let's talk about know your environment before the adversary does. You know, this is my house, I have to defend it. It's a great line. You know, Kevin understood every part of his environment. In fact, he mapped it. So we can sort of see down there in his battle plans, right? But he understood what his choke points were. He predicted where the Wet Bandits were going to go after. He put a lot of thought into planning all of his different traps and tripwires that he put in there. And in cyber deception, we need to do the same thing, right? Before deploying our decoys, we need to understand what is normal, right? What is our network topology? What's our critical assets? What are our normal traffic flows? We're going to talk a little bit in a moment about crown jewels analysis, really understanding not just what we think is important, but what actually is important. What are those critical things, both from our own perspective, but also from the adversary's perspective. And I think this is something that gets lost sometimes. Right, if we take MITRE, for example, MITRE is large. We operate federally funded research and development centers. So we oftentimes, I think our IP as our, you know, our crown jewels, But for some adversaries, it might not be our intellectual property. It might be the fact that we have a lot of people going into government buildings every day, or we have government systems, or whatever it might be. So always thinking about it from both perspectives. And really remembering that the best deceptions are placed with purpose in areas adversaries are most likely to explore, and also that protect what's most important to us. I think oftentimes, especially with some of the different open source honeypots and things like that are out there, it's tempting to sort of grab a thing and throw it out there and see what happens, which can be really interesting, but doesn't necessarily give us that sort of bang for our buck that we might be looking for. And really, our main principle here is that visibility precedes deception. You can't protect what you don't understand. And I think in today's complex systems and architecture, knowing what matters most isn't always obvious. Let's set aside the fact that, asset management is really difficult, and depending on size and resources of your organization, just knowing what's there is confusing. But we have interconnected systems, we have supply chains, we have dynamic environments, shadow IT. I was talking to a friend of mine who is a K through 12 network admin, and he was saying that, there's a new thing popping up on his network. They just got internet connected statues and internet connected ovens in a bunch of the school systems, right? All of these different things that are continuously kind of popping up. Disconnect between kind of the business side and the security side in terms of what's critical and what's where and what has to be connected to what. And there's also a lot of indirect impact, right? Sometimes a non-critical system can disrupt critical operations. Another friend of mine, one day, they had no idea that they had one sensor that if this sensor went down, it sent a signal to tripwire that locked all the key card doors. And it was like I think it had something to do with HVAC or something, because the building wasn't supposed to be accessible if the HVAC had certain issues or whatever it might be, right? But they had no idea that this one sensor malfunctioning was going to make it so that no one's key cards worked, and they had to go back to like lock and keys on doors. And so because of all of this, it becomes really important for us to think about identifying what is most critical, but from sort of a systematic and clear data-driven way of doing this. And crown jewels analysis can help with this. So crown jewels analysis is both a model as well as a methodology. So we're going to talk about it kind of from both perspectives, but I think from the starting point, starting just to think about this as a model is a really helpful way to get started. What's important to remember here is that oftentimes, like we were discussing, some crown jewels are going to be known, and CJA is meant to confirm those known ones, but it oftentimes also reveals hidden or unexpected ones. And it really helps us to enables us to prioritize, if we have limited resources, how can we, again, get that biggest bang for our buck by protecting the things that matter most? So a crown jewel is an asset, whether cyber or information, whose failure to perform or to perform as it was intended causes a mission objective to fail. I know some of this language is a little bit DOW-esque. So we can think of this from a business perspective, if we want to change the language around a little bit, as business objectives instead of mission objectives. But what are the core things that you need to do in order to operate? And we sort of build up these pyramids where at the top we have our mission objectives, and then layered down from that, we'll see this in a subsequent slide. I'll kind of break this down, but we kind of break this down all the way until we get to assets. And then we work our way back up and we say, if this asset were to disappear, can I still accomplish this mission objective? So in a second, we're going to see this a little bit more clearly here. So this was one we actually was in a open source paper around healthcare. So it was written in terms of a healthcare objective, but we have our objectives at the top. We have our tasks one layer down from that. We have our system functions, and we have our cyber assets. Depending on the specific environment or scope of your assessment, you can have more or less layers. There's some variability in specifics, depending on what level of detail. This one, they had 3. The idea here is, again, you have what are your major tasks? What are the functions to do those tasks? What are the cyber assets that support that? And then we work our way back and we say, okay, if this cyber asset were to disappear, can this system function still occur? Yes or no? Okay, if that system function were to disappear, will this task still be accomplishable? Yes or no? All the way back to our big objective at the top. As we see on our picture at the right, CA1, when that disappears, we are no longer able to perform our healthcare objective. And so therefore that would be considered a crown jewel. However, if we look over at CA6 on the second picture, when that fails, we are still able to perform some of our system functions. We have some that need workarounds or are degraded, but when we work our way all the way back up to the top, we see that our one objective is still green. We are still able to accomplish it. Therefore, that is not a crown jewel. We sort of repeat this process so that we can start getting an understanding of all of those different cyber assets. When we think about interpreting the results, so I wanted to show this one just to show, here is another open source example. This one came from a systems engineering paper that we had online. Here, you'll notice that that last row is an information asset. So they chose to think about it in terms of information instead of system functions. Different view of the same problem. But when we read down, this is how we understand our dependencies. So what depends on what? And we read up, and this is how we understand our impact. What impacts what? And so again, at the end of this, we have sort of this mental model of where our important things are, but we can also sort of have this specific methodology where we can calculate various scores for each of these things, sort of arrive at, oh, here's our sets. We'll move on to lesson 2, but please, if you have any questions, put them into the comments. I'm more than happy to dive more into any of this needed. But we'll move on to our second lesson from Kevin, which is deception is more than detection. Kevin didn't just catch the wet bandits. He made the house risky, confusing, literally painful, and costly for them to operate in. So when Kevin put on that fake party, all the moving shadows, the loud music, he changed the wet bandits' perception of risk. They actually drove away that day and decided not to go after the house. Right? How do we cause our adversaries to go through that same calculus and say, you know, there's just a little bit too much uncertainty here. There's too much ambiguity. I'm not going to waste my time. Or, you know, this is just going to cost me more to do whatever it is that I'm trying to do. Therefore, you know, they're going to go more slowly. They're going to spend more time, more resources, more money, more painful for them. Maybe we're not dropping an iron on their face, but we still have that same impact. You know, how do we make cyber no longer the lowest hanging fruit in terms of, you know, ease of going after us? So when you think about cyber deception, right, we want to change behavior, not just detect attackers. There's a real opportunity here for us as a community to drive the cost of cyber. I think there was a great talk a few years back from a researcher who was saying how they were doing AI generated medical records. And they were specifically looking at, you know, could you change the cost of medical records on the black market similarly to how the cost of credit cards are so low? Because oftentimes by the time someone has bought a credit card number, it's, you know, it's no longer valid, and the credit card companies are good at detecting fraud and all that. You know, could we do something similar to drive down the value of other pieces of data so there's less of a market for this and therefore less people trying to steal it? We really want to think about increasing that cost, effort, and uncertainty for adversaries. And our principle here is that deception should shape the adversary's decision making, not just reveal it. Now, do I think every organization is ready to jump right into, you know, deception for impact? Probably not. And for most of us, starting with deception for detection and that being kind of our main driver is perfectly fine and where most of us should start. However, you know, as we start getting more mature and helping each other and thinking about this, there's opportunities to move beyond that and still get the value of the detection piece, but also think about some of these larger, longer lasting strategies. Our big goal here is, you know, how do we drive up the cost and drive down the value? For example, can we cause adversaries to spend resources developing or using capabilities to target fake assets, fake vulnerabilities? Can we pollute good or real data? Can we detect or contain operations more quickly? Can we encourage them to target things that are fake or less valuable versus the things that are actually valuable to us? Can we increase the time required for malicious operations? There's a great story about how MITRE at one point was running a deception op, and the adversary realized they were in the middle of a deception op, got really annoyed, and then spent the next like 4 hours like trashing the environment that they were in. It was a VM. We reset it, no harm, no foul, but that was 4 hours that they spent messing around in our environment instead of targeting someone else, right? Thinking about that on a grander scale, obviously, how can we kind of move towards that? And then best case, you know, how can we cause adversaries to self-select away from real targets? I actually recently ran a deception op with some scammers, and we got them to block the phone number, which was an actual number of a real victim. Right, that's great. If they never target her again because they realized that that phone number was part of a deception operation, that's amazing. And Shane, this is actually something that Shane has come up with. So when we have the panel, if anyone has questions, please chat more with Shane on this one. I think it's a really, really great analogy. Shane talks about adversary engagement and affecting adversary engagement in the same way we think about the project management triangle. So if anyone's familiar with this, it's this idea of defining scope as in terms of schedule or time, quality, and cost. And our question here is, how do we expand the adversary scope of their operation by making it take longer, making it cost more, and decreasing the quality of what they're getting from these operations? And if we sort of think about it, this triangle, it becomes easier for us. I think effect sometimes is kind of intangible, but this gives us a really clear-cut way of thinking about this. And again, if anyone has questions on any of these lessons, please feel free to ask questions, and we will chat through them or provide answers to them at some point. But I want to move on to our last and final lesson, which is use what you have and layer your defenses. Kevin used ordinary household items as believable traps, and he built a gauntlet from things already in the house, right? He had all these familiar things: paint cans, doorknobs, toy cars, irons. It fit naturally into the environment. It made the trap credible and effective. The more we can make our deceptions blend in, the more we can reuse things that are already there, it gives us new opportunities, right? And I think there's this new idea that I've been really excited about and been involved in some research lately with what we call living off the land engagement. We're sort of flipping the script and saying, if the adversary can live off my land, so can I. And so how can I repurpose existing assets, data, artifacts in order to have convincing decoys, breadcrumbs, tripwires? There's lots of opportunities for this. I think this is a new area to kind of explore and grow with. Lots of places where this might fit, right? So if you're an organization that you're not quite large enough or ready for a commercial solution quite yet, this is a great way to start kind of dipping your toes in the water and thinking about, how do I validate the things I want to do? How do I convince senior leadership that this is a technology I want to invest in? How do I collect ROI before I think about scaling? How do I even define what the heck I'm going to need going forward, right? Great opportunity to think about, how do I take things that already exist and repurpose them? And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you're a more mature organization, using this to supplement existing things that do scale a little bit better to run boutique one-off campaigns or targeted operations, fantastic opportunity to start thinking like that, as well as to do sort of rapid ad hoc intel collection or other things like that. And, really, I think the principle of all this is that the best deception doesn't look like deception, it looks like opportunity. So for example, if you are going to have some decoy files on your network, you don't necessarily need to have a specific solution in order to put those files out there. You could just have files. Let's say you have a Windows box, you put them in a folder, and you have your Windows Event Manager watch that folder differently, or whatever your EDR solution is, watch the folder differently. The trick here is really thinking about, what does my normal user do? And what is it that is sort of different from that? And we'll talk more about that in a second. One of the ways that we like to think about this is to kind of map all of this to other things in the MITRE ecosystem. So for those who are familiar with Attacker Ready and Engage, I think this is a great way to bring those in. So we like to think about, what are the common IT elements in my environment? How might an attacker go after that? And we can use attack to sort of understand which techniques go after which things in our network. And then we can sit there and say, okay, attack maps to engage. What are my opportunities for engagement? Okay, now I understand what the deception opportunity is. Can I think about what the high level, like living off the land opportunity might look like? And then finally turning this into an implementation that works for you. And again, whether that is, deploying things that are already on the network, or maybe it's using your monitoring solutions to monitor specific things in the network. There's a bunch of different opportunities that we can have when we think about this. So these are just a couple ideas to get you started. There's a near infinite number of ways to implement living off the land engagement. And part of what's exciting about this, I think it's an opportunity for the community to kind of bring out new ones and find new ways to do this. We'll start with a couple. So the first is, obfuscated or decoy accounts. So maybe you have real admin accounts, or you create accounts that look like they are admin accounts. Watch who's going after those, creating decoy accounts on public sites. as a way of understanding how your employees might be targeted. Note of sort of obligatory warning there, which is certain websites, especially social media sites, will have terms of service that say you're not supposed to have fake accounts. So watch your terms of service, make sure you're not violating anything. This is where having your lawyers involved with all of this is always a good idea, just to make sure that you're within your acceptable risk tolerance and following all the rules. But it could be a great way of understanding, okay, I know a lot of my employees have accounts on XYZ sites. Can I create a decoy account and understand how that's targeted to understand how my employees might be targeted? We might have some opportunities to scatter, remote access artifacts. So, a PowerShell script to create some ransomware deployment protocol, RDP protocol breadcrumbs. Maybe you're leading to a timeout or a honeypot or an alert, whatever it might be. It's a great chance to sort of have these different forensic artifacts that you scatter around. I think this one's especially important because, especially when we're talking about forensic artifacts like an RDP breadcrumb, there's no legitimate reason why an employee who finds one of these breadcrumbs should ever then take the jump of going from, okay, I don't remember ever having this session. Let me go connect to the post over there. No, very kind of minimally, they should be picking up the phone and calling their IT or security and saying, hey, I'm finding this thing that I don't think is me. But you want to find things that aren't going to interrupt a user's normal flow so that you're not getting false positives. And so also you're not interrupting your users. So I think adding breadcrumbs like that is a fantastic way to start thinking of. You could potentially add bogus entries to your .ssh or other places where you'll see connections. So again, great way of scattering little breadcrumbs that are leading to honeypots. Thinking about seeding deceptive logs and files, right? So how can we create enticingly fake logs or inject false entries? Maybe we're dropping decoys, directories or file shares, and we can potentially even monitor these with your existing EDR or Windows event logs to be able to see when they're accessed. Deploying common binaries, but neutering them. So there's a great way of, I've read a paper lately of someone going through GTFO bins and saying, hey, these are things that are commonly used for adversary living off the land. So therefore, I'm going to specifically put things on my network that I want the adversary to try to use when they're living off the land, but I'm going to know that they don't actually work, or I've made it so that the tool won't work as the adversary intended, but I get a high fidelity alert that someone is doing something that they shouldn't. Making workstations resemble analysis environments. I think this one's kind of a fun one. Just putting Ghidra or IDER Pro or Wireshark on desktops even that have no legitimate use. This is less of a detection and more of that deterrence, slow them down, make them act a little bit more cautiously, right? If they think they're on a workstation that is a security researcher, they might tread a little bit more carefully than they would elsewhere. And this last one I think is really interesting and kind of gets at the heart of the lesson on why it's so important to understand normal for you is introducing a new normal. One of the things that I think is very difficult right now with living off the land, and honestly, deception in general, is we oftentimes don't understand enough of what normal looks like so that we aren't accidentally interrupting our real users. I know one organization that tried to get started with deception. They had a bunch of tripwires that they thought, oh, this isn't going to bother anyone. They made some bad choices. They had alarms going off all the time. The SOC got annoyed, management got annoyed, people using those machines got annoyed, and they ended up pulling the plug on their new effort. And really it all stemmed from they didn't understand well enough what normal looked like in terms of user behavior. The other interesting thing here is understanding normal gives us an opportunity to understand the difference between normal and what a new normal for the adversary. So for example, I was working in a lab where it was pretty small. Everyone knew who the two admins were. We're going to call them Joe and Jane. Let's say Joe and Jane, any machine labeled with their names, anyone in the environment would know, I'm not going to touch that. That must be an admin thing. Not my place. An adversary coming in would have no idea. So if I created decoys and things like that and labeled them Joe and Jane, my real users are going to stay away. My adversaries are going to go after them. And now I have decoys that I can protect my real users from interference. I can also think about injecting a new normal, right? So for example, always running command scripts with purposeful mistakes or typos before they're run correctly. Or if you have automated database queries, you always capitalize, the third letter. Adversary coming in is not going to know about that normal because that's not quote unquote real normal. And, that's another way of getting their stuff to stick out when otherwise it might not. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to the panel. I know we flew through a lot of stuff, especially in that last slide. So please feel free if you have questions. Really happy to dive back into any of that.
Thanks, Marita. We do have questions here, so let's get started. Maybe we could start with the first one. Someone wanted to kind of learn a little bit more about, they missed the context, like MO means in this context if you were talking, and wanted to see if there's a paper guide that is there that you could share potentially.
Sorry, I missed which part specifically were they looking for a paper?
MO, like they talked about what does MO mean in the context of crown jewel failing?
Mission objective. So that is, and again, you can think about your organization and what makes sense for the right language to kind of articulate some of these, because this work has been done in a lot of it through government. We talk about mission objectives. That might not be the right way to think about it. So business objective or business goal might be a better way for you to think about it. But there are some papers online around crown jewels analysis. I can find some and I'll send them over to you, and if you can send them out to everyone.
Perfect. All right, let's take some other questions. What's the biggest misconception that organizations have about cyber deception, especially when they first start implementing these strategies?
Shane, do you want to jump in first? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Shane.
Yeah, sure. So, often the hardest hurdle to overcome is the misconception that cyber deception is hacking back. And, one of the things that, the adversary would love to do is reinforce that message so you don't engage in, cyber deception. But keep in mind, this is your stuff. If it is your stuff, you do things all day to it, to manage it, but also to break it and interact with it. And as a result, you want to keep that in mind to overcome, that you're not hacking back. You're just managing your stuff and doing things that you're intending to do without disruption. And then there's one other piece to that, is that without lying to the adversary somewhere, everything enumerated is true and believable. So that means every account that they go and enumerate on an endpoint, that's all going to be true. Every credential they pick up is all going to be true. So if you never lie to them, then you're never going to get that opportunity to be able to detect and potentially ferret them out early. And you'll want to lie to them early and often. If we look back to the Kevin McCallister scenario, he lied to Harry and Marv when he put up that party, motivated them to wait while Kevin could develop a plan.
Great. Marita or Cyril, do you want to add anything, or we could go to other questions? We have a few. Okay. So let's go to the next question. We often see adversaries using LOTL techniques. How does deception offer opportunities to detect these type of behaviors?
Shirley, you want to jump in first, or do you want me to go first?
Sure. You go first.
Go ahead, Shane.
Shane, go ahead, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. The adversary, hey, live off the land techniques, they're using your own management tools against you. They exist on your environment to help you manage that environment. But those same tools are offering you an opportunity to shape their mindset and also make them noisy and loud. This will date me a little bit, but you might remember the tool Backtrack, that is now what we know affectionately as Kali. But the tagline was, the quieter you become, the more you are able to hear. And our goal currently is to quietly make them as noisy through opportunities like, using your own tools to make them as noisy as possible, much like Kevin did with the micro machines, the little toy cars and the broken shards of Christmas balls. From the construct of, an OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act. At the minimum, you know where they are in your house, and you know where you'll need to orient yourself in order to position yourself for defense, at least. And it'll give you time to think.
Cyril, you had something to add?
Sure, yeah. So I think, living off the land attacks are definitely very evasive and hard to detect traditionally. So there are like built-in tools and utilities available in the operating system which attackers are using. And so, for example, on a Windows OS, NetSH, is even net.exe built-in tools that are already available that can be used by attackers to do reconnaissance. And so now the idea is that if that's what the attacker is doing, then if you try to find evidence based on malware, then one is unlikely to find it because there is no malware being used. Attackers are actually using the built-in OS and tools. So the question is, what is the role that deception can play in such a thing? So ultimately, let's look at it from the point of the attacker and say they're using the built-in OS tools and utilities, but they're using it for a purpose. And so the purpose is typically to find crown jewels, like Marita pointed out. And in order to get to the crown jewels, they typically need credentials or they need vulnerability exploit methods. So they need these type of techniques from an attacker's point of view. And so the deceptions, by seeding relevant strategic deceptions in the environment, for example, decoys in the network that represent a crown jewel for an attacker, or on the endpoint where the attacker is present, you seed honey tokens, which are deceptive credentials that represent a service account to that type of a decoy. Now, when the attacker is doing living off the land techniques, they still have to go and try to get access to these pieces of data. So by seeding the right pieces of data and providing the right targets to the attacker, you can detect those techniques with precision.
Sounds good. Let's go to the next question. What are some of the most common challenges organizations face when trying to implement deception programs, and how can they overcome them? Marita?
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. And I think a lot of it is honestly not necessarily a technical challenge, right? Deception technology in one form or another has existed for a while. And there's lots of cool new technology coming out and lots of cool inroads, and all of that is amazing and things to consider. However, I think some of the biggest challenges, especially getting started, are a people problem, right? And I think it's both a people problem in terms of convincing people on the technology and the value proposition. And secondly, it's a problem in terms of collaboration and coordination. So we'll start with the first one, which is the convincing people of the value. One of the things that's very challenging with deception is, especially when we're talking about some of the things outside of detection, it's really hard to measure. And I will preface this with, I don't have a good answer, which is a little bit unsatisfying, but I will work on things that I do have answers for too, right? But it's really hard to measure how many times you deterred an adversary from going after you if the whole premise is they didn't go after you, right? And that doesn't quite fit our model of how we think about security and how we measure tools and how we measure, what is value. So I think part of this is some of the value of deception doesn't measure the way we traditionally measure security tool value. And as a community, we need to figure out and have conversations on how do we adjust the way we measure, because if our measurements are causing us to turn away from tools that can have an impact, that is not useful to the community. So I think one piece is that. The second is, I think there's a reluctance to share when tools are successful. Oftentimes, because a lot of folks are thinking rightly so about the OPSEC side of deception and have chosen not to speak about using deception publicly, they also don't talk about their wins publicly. That is harmful for the community as a whole because it means we have less data about when deception is successful. Now, I'm not advocating that everyone talk about all the times they're doing deception. I think the choice to decide whether you're going to talk publicly and use that as a deterrence mechanism in and of itself or not is something that is specific to the organization. But finding ways to share out deception wins, whether it's being anonymized back through vendors, whether it's being anonymized and shared out through other sharing mechanisms, I think it's very important that as a community, we think about how can we share some of this stuff? And then lastly, I think it's a push for more research needs, right? My team is involved in research. We have researchers at MITRE who are thinking about this question. There was some work happening with IARPA around value of deception. So the more and more we can support the folks who are trying to sort of show the value, and the more we can contribute data as defenders. Can you tell them from Boston? Data. The better it is as a whole. So there is one side of things where this is less of me answering it and more of me asking the community to be able to help us better answer it. The second piece, I think that is a big challenge for organizations is the coordination side of things. Deception to be done effectively requires levels of coordination that are not kind of traditional in our security tooling, right? If I'm going to deploy, let's say AV, I don't need to think all that strategically about how and where and why and all the things we just talked about in the planning parts of deception, but I do for deception. And also to be more effective, I have to engage with folks who oftentimes don't see themselves as part of the security conversation. So for example, we were doing some stuff that needed decoy personas. MITRE uses Workday. Workday, every employee has a Workday profile that is tied into a dashboard, that is tied into a manager, that is tied in, that is tied in, that is tied in. In order to sort of effectively do decoys, I would need to go back, and this was for a research project. So caveat, I am not part of MITRE InfoSec. Again, I'm on the research side of things, but just to do research, we were going to have to go to HR and have conversations on, hey, we need decoy personas. Those are not folks who normally have security conversations. And so figuring out how to have that level of communication and figuring out ways to educate folks who are not necessarily normally part of security, I think can be a challenge. But if we can navigate that, a really successful one. The last piece that I will put in there as well is I think there's also a level of disconnect sometimes between the folks who are designing the deceptions and the folks in the SOC who are actually seeing the alerts, right? And a deception alert is inherently different than other alerts that you are seeing. And if your SOC doesn't understand what is the meaning behind a deception alert, you're going to lose out in the value proposition of deception. So for example, if I have, say, a fake folder on my, let's go with it, I have my CEO, I have a fake folder on my CEO's desktop, and the CEO knows to never go in that folder, and the only person clicking on that folder should be an adversary. Anything happening to that folder should be a giant flashing neon light of something bad that was not necessarily the same for other alerts that might be going off. And so you have to understand what that tripwire is, why, what is the risk of someone normal, like a normal user, clicking on that, and if that and where that risk is comparative to the alert, and suddenly it skyrockets in priority. And so making sure that is communicated and your SOC is able to see that and understand that distinction can be a really tricky thing to navigate, just because again, it's different than other security technology.
Thanks, Marita. Shane, do you have anything to add here?
No, I think that Marita really hit the high points, and the one thing I would kind of also foot stomp is the fact that the point of view, whether folks are aware that deception's in play or not within an environment, I think that's a personal choice for your organization. But I think that there's the concept that you don't talk about it, and I think that that's probably misinformed. If you are talking about it, at least the stakeholders and potential stakeholders in the future know that this is a construct that you've engaged in or looking to engage in, and as a result, it'll cause some of the traditional threats like insider threat and others to pause if there's somebody already in your system that's an adversary or an insider, to tread carefully. And as a result, I think that there's some value in at least talking about it more broadly internally if you're looking to engage. It makes your program more successful when they understand it. And even just engaging with your lawyers and telling them, hey, deception's something that we're looking to do. This is something similar that you do with copyright protection and the concept of paper towns and on maps. And so as a result, I think that there's value in kind of trying to overcome the hurdles of each one of those stakeholders in talking about that more broadly, as well as the impact to adversary or insider actions.
And I think Shane hit on something really important with the lawyer comment. Having your lawyers understand what you're doing and how to get to yes with your lawyers is infinitely helpful in the future, right? We've been really fortunate with MITRE, where we've had some great lawyers who have been able to understand what we're doing and help us do more. But if you have someone who doesn't understand it, making sure you're spending that time to get them there will only benefit you in the future.
Great. We have another 5 minutes left and many questions, and you still have like time. Please feel free to submit your question. We'll take it now, or we'll respond via email after the webinar. But let's take this one. Could implementing cyber deception affect my cyber risk rating by BitSight and security scorecard?
It's an interesting one. And I will not, I can't comment on the companies in particular. And Shane, I don't know if you have more experience with BitSight or the scorecard stuff in terms of what specifically they are rating, but especially if you are doing things internal to your network that are specifically meant to detect behavior, you're specifically trying to detect behavior that is already on the inside. It's not about opening up vulnerabilities on the outside. Opening up problems on the outside is you're going to just catch all the crap on the internet, and that isn't helpful to anyone. It's about things that are already inside and attracting them in specific directions. And so I would say the things we are talking about are not things that are going to hit on any of the things that BitSight or others are doing. In terms of we're not introducing things externally, we're introducing things internally that are meant to move adversaries in one direction or another, not to expand your attack surface. However, if you are trying to do things on the CTI side that are specific, again, I would not recommend putting things on the internet. You're going to just get all the crap on the internet. Being more tailored than that. But it is important to think through the repercussions of anything that you're doing for exactly those reasons of what else might be impacted and what are the ramifications of doing things. But yes, I would say against putting stuff out in the internet. One, because of impacts to anyone looking to do those sorts of assessments, but then two, from the perspective of you're just going to get so much crap, it's not going to be useful to you. But Shane, do you have any other specific thoughts on that?
The only thing I would throw out is yes, I in the past may have gone down that road a little bit on the external facing side. The one thing we talked about the lawyers, keeping lawyers involved. One of the things you have to be very careful of is potentially market moving SEC information that creates a problem. But in some cases, there might be some very specific, very narrowly tailored, with only your lawyers involved, where that might be the case where you are doing those things, whether it affects your reputation or your scores. Those are things that are, of course, things you take into consideration. But there have been narrowly tailored ways to kind of go after those, but you still have to be very lockstep with what you can do and avoid maybe some of those challenges if you're publicly traded or you're concerned about reputational damage, that you're ready to go and say, hey, this was a trick all the time, and those guys fell for it, and so therefore maybe you should leave us alone. But that's a very as Moretta, you point out, it's you catch everything then potentially.
Sounds
I will
good.
say on that one other kind of specific example on that one was we were running an operation. We were slightly, again, research purposes only. We were slightly worried that if someone was going to try to do a haha MITRE, like we caught you. So we actually took the full design plans for the deception op, encrypted that, and that was all the data in the directories that we were playing around with. So if anyone stole our data and tried to leak it, we could say, here's the key. And by the way, proof that we planned this.
Very good. All right, we have many questions, and I'm kind of afraid to kind of take any more at this time, but we'll make sure that we'll respond to those via email offline after that, as when we send the recording of the webinar, we'll make sure that we'll reach out to you and answer some of the unanswered questions that we have. With that, let me thank you, Marita and Shane for joining. Shane, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but I'm glad that you are at least able to log in via phone and contributed to that. Thanks to you, Cyril, as always. And again, I will send out the recordings later today, tomorrow, and have a great rest of the day wherever you are. Thanks again.
Thank you.